them and bring home and make them survive. On junipers, a lot of time, and from my experience, basically collecting junipers all over the world, most of the time we don't get home many roots because they are pretty semi-subdesertic species and they have very long taproots. So we want to get a good amount of foliage because they have this capacity of absorbing moisture from the foliage, and with a good technique, basically we can make them survive as like cuttings. So we collect almost with no roots, we keep in a protected environment away from direct sun and wind. We basically mist the foliage multiple times a day, and the foliage helps the tree to rebuild that root system that was damaged or we didn't have on the collection. The deciduous tree is another strategy. I think they, during the winter time, basically they hold the strength in the trunk, and most of the time deciduous have a very extended root ball. So we have to cut a lot of roots in order to collect the trees. So the collection is, on what I do, it's done during winter. I collect them, I can cut big branches, I can remove most of the root ball because the energy is in the trunk, and then I use the technique of the black plastic technique, that is basically bag the trunk in this black environment, a dark environment. So you hold the moisture and you basically force the trunk to grow. The cell of the wood, even if there is no moisture coming from the roots, stays alive, and basically the cell of the wood has the capacity of regenerating just with the moisture that is in the trunk, and the tree basically is forced to push out. Obviously there are still no roots down the line to bring up water. But then what I do, so the trees stay bagged all winter, and then in this period of the year when I see the same species in my garden start budding out, I know that eventually those trees are also start budding out and creating some leaves in darkness, so no photosynthesis, and I transition from the black bag to the transparent bag. So basically having some leaves, I allow those leaves still in a very wet environment to start performing some photosynthesis and sending a message down to the stump to create some new roots. As much, yes.
So when you do that initial, you're taking the deciduous tree off the mountains, are you okay with working those roots pretty hard, trying to really go ahead and get some of that field soil off?
You have to do it. So I make you an example. We have this area in the center of Italy. It's a very, is high altitude, maybe between 6,000 and 9,000 feet. A lot of clay, and is where the best oaks grows. They are super twisted. They look almost like pines. But obviously oaks, they have the tendency to grow very long roots to anchor in the ground and find water. We have to cut those roots, and I have to force the trunks to survive in that way. But in the years, protecting them in a greenhouse plus the bag, I'm having almost 100%. The trick and the secret is not making them flashing out, because if you use the black bag and you tape very tight to the base of the container, you hold the moisture, they will bud out. The trick is the transition. So when you transition to the transparent bag, you want to see elongation in the new shoots to know that they are rebuilding the vascular system and they are rooting, and slowly you poke holes in the bag to remove the extra moisture and basically make the tree self-efficient. And doing that, you transition the tree from not having any roots to having some small roots, and then to rebuilding all the circle by performing photosynthesis and developing roots.
Can you talk, I know you do, talk about a little the type of trees that you're collecting in your environment?
About collecting from the wild, I will show in detail everything, so I will just shortly say something. It's what I think is very important. Yes, you can cut the big roots, but you need to preserve all the small roots that are more close to the to the trunk, and try to not disturb totally the root ball. And if you do that, then the surviving rate is very, very high. One thing that people maybe make a mistake, that they don't, you need to shorten the root ball so that it can fit into the bonsai pot, and that is the moment. Not to plant tree and say, okay, in the 5 years I will make it shorter and then I'm going to put it into bonsai pot. That is a mistake, because in 5 years you will have the foliage and all the ramification and the trunk, and that is additional stress to the tree. So for the deciduous and the evergreen trees, do the balance immediately after the collecting. Cut everything what you need in the crown and cut the roots. Of course, not every species is reacting in the same way, and with years of experience, you will know how much you can damage the prunus, how much you can damage the carpinus, and you will get you will get an idea. After the collecting, what is important? It's important to bring a bottle of the water with you when you are collecting, so that you can make everything wet, and then put it in the plastic foil and bring it home. Because if the bura is blowing from the north,
yeah, the hydration is what
very dry north wind, and you collect the tree and you just put it in your car like that, everything is going to dry out. So the collecting is actually not about you and what is easier for you to do. It's about the trees. You need to understand that you need to be careful, and you need to understand what the tree needs to survive. So at home, I just do the cutting of the roots to make it more shallow, and then I cut the upper part, and I put it into the greenhouse. I have a greenhouse with a fogger system, the system of foggers. Yes, I do it automatically, so it's putting the water out. I don't know, every 20 minutes. 30 seconds or something like that, all day long. So I spend a lot of water to obtain moisture environment for the trees. Also, I have what is the name? The heating cables inside the greenhouse. What is important about the collecting is where you live. In which climate do you live, and do you have frosts? So it's also, yeah. So I'm also now in the area we have frosts about, I don't know, 10-20 days in the year. So you need to take care of it. And if the frost is coming, you need to put the cables on. There is an automatic system.
Do you do anything about prevention for fungal issue?
Sorry?
Do you do anything about prevention for fungal issue? Fungi?
No, I don't have problems with any disease, actually.
Oh, that's good.
Sometimes some caterpillars appear. Yeah, it's nice.
Yeah, I find out, especially with oaks, that when I cut a lot of big roots and then the trees stay in soil, a little bit with the original soil eventually,
yeah,
it can develop a little bit of fungal issue from inside. So I normally, when I bring home stumps, I sit them in water with fungicide for a night before I plant. So basically they suck the water with fungicide, and this will protect the tree, because also in the enclosed environment or even in the greenhouse, Carpinus is very good because it's self-defend pretty much, but other species like Prunus or oaks, they can get some fungal infection, and you don't see in a shorter period. You will see in 2 or 3 years, because the fungal issue will grow inside of the tree, and then you start losing randomly some branches, or prunus will start doing what we call gomosis, and these will always stay within the tree and always affect, for us in bonsai, we want to style a tree and a branch will stay a branch for a long time. We don't want to style a branch and then, after 5 years that branch died out and you have to rebuild another one. So I like to do that with a little fungal prevention, because in the long run is always helping, let's say.
I really like the idea you said about taking water out in the mountain. I went collecting with the backcountry guys early in my career, and one of the things they did is had a lot of water out there. And after getting that root ball out, you'll notice too the soil is very hydrophobic. So a lot of times you just pour the water on there and it just kind of leaks away. So they taught me a technique of drinking water, to really, try to mince the soil a little bit to get it a little wet, and then you can start.
That sounds like Steve with message.
That's exactly what he did. Best lesson you taught me was.
But there is also a bottle with a spray.
You can do that too.
There is a name for that, but I can't say that.
Okay, it's recorded.
So Andrew, talk a little bit about maybe, I know you're, being up in Portland area, you're dealing with a lot of field-grown trees often, Telperian trees or field-grown. What do you talk about, taking those initial root balls and how you kind of approach that from the beginning?
Yeah, if you come to my backyard, I have about 100 plants from Telperion farms. They came in as field-grown trees, but they were basically treated just like Yamadori. So when you plant something in the ground, you put it in a constrained space. They use grow bags, and then you just forget about it for 20 years. It's growing almost more like a Yamadori than it is a field-grown bonsai that's being trained and styled and whatnot. So my collection process for those was very similar to what they were just talking about. Is doing really big cuts in the beginning. I think what Marija said is really key. That's the main difference between deciduous and conifers. When you collect a conifer, you don't really want to touch it or do much with it. When you collect a deciduous, that's your best time to do a big chop on the top of the plant and big chop on the roots to get it in a constrained space. Because the tree has the most stored energy at that point, especially if it was a field-grown tree that wasn't taken care of. I had trees, I have a Dawn redwood with a trunk this big that came in the yard as a complete cutting. No roots, or it had roots and I cut them off because they were 10 feet into the ground. Same with a black pine. I have a black pine with a trunk this big that I brought into the yard with 0 roots. And with all of this stored energy, it rejuvenated and grew a root system. You can never do that with a collected ponderosa pine that you get out of the Rockies. But with a tree with a lot of stored energy, you can do that kind of thing. I think it's also important to talk a little bit of context. Why do we get collected trees to begin with? All of us up here don't really have a bonsai farm that I know of. We want some really interesting material to start playing with first. How many of you, when you walk through the room, can find a nice old Japanese maple to just buy off the shelf? Does anyone have access to those? I'd love to know the source.
I know a guy.
But you don't have that luxury if you live in Missouri or Minnesota or something like that. So we have to find material to play with, and there's a lot of interesting material out there. I think what Marija is doing is so special because she's finding trees that aren't traditionally used for bonsai. I've never seen a pistache bonsai in kokofu. But finding the material and then letting our practice of bonsai dictate creating it special, putting it in a pot, training it and whatnot. I'm collecting a lot of things in Pacific Northwest that nobody's really played with much before. I've never seen an alder bonsai in the kokofu or a cottonwood or vine maple, but if you walk around the woods, there's probably a lot of interesting plants kind of around here, and it's a really nice fast track because you can start doing bonsai things right away rather than grow a maple over a long period of time. You get something very different in feeling, and maybe you can grow something that's higher quality, but what's our stump of a hornbeam going to look like in 20 years from now? It's going to look pretty special, even if it has some flaws or whatnot built in. So I think it's a great way to kind of get started, to build a collection. All of you are consumers of bonsai. And so all of us are trying to build gardens to sell trees to all of you, to have a nice, beautiful space in our own collections, and Yamadori is a really good fast track for that.
So Bjorn, I know that you are being back in the States. You initially did a lot of native junipers you were working with, transitioning those. Also, if you can relate, maybe from the time in Japan, did you do much of that transitioning those Yamadoris that just weren't around as much anymore? Talk about maybe a little bit of that transition of.
Yeah, so I have to confess, I've only ever been collecting trees one time, ever. It was with some friends out in Arizona a few years ago. They took me out to collect some one-seed junipers. Are you guys familiar with one-seed junipers? Yeah, this is something that's become, I think, a little bit more popular over the last few years in the States, and that's
thanks to you.
Yeah, well, I got really lucky in dealing with someone from Denver named Richard Lee. I don't know if you guys are familiar with him. He's a Vietnamese fellow, but lives out in Denver, owns a bunch of property in New Mexico, and he contacted me right
Where
before.
exactly in New Mexico?
Yeah.
So
I didn't draw it before I got
so I've never been out to his place before to see these, but I do know he's collecting. He owns property in the Four Corners area of New Mexico. So it's not super high elevation. I think it's around 4,500 feet. So it doesn't get crazy cold out there, but these trees are essentially, it's almost like high desert out there. So the trees are getting whipped around by the wind. The low temperatures in the winter, from my understanding, only get down into like the teens Fahrenheit. So what's that, probably -5, -6 degrees Celsius. So it's not crazy cold out there, but it's the harsh environment where these trees grow that makes them look the way they do. And apparently these trees grow about 1 inch in diameter for every 85 years in this environment. Right? So incredibly slow. But when the trees are collected and they're brought to a more optimal growing environment, like Tennessee, for example, where it's very hot and very humid in the summer, they'll put on 4 feet of extension growth in a single growing season. Right? So some of the trees that we had in my nursery that Richard had collected, we eventually transitioned them out of their initial soil that he had collected them in. But I would imagine that some of those trees were probably 500, 600, 700 years old, just based on the growth habits of those plants in that environment. But what Richard was doing when he was collecting those trees is he was going out and collecting enormous amounts of soil with those plants. They're somewhat similar to Utah junipers. I don't know if you guys have ever worked with Utahs. You've got California junipers on one end of the spectrum, Utah junipers kind of in the middle, and then you've got one-seed junipers in terms of foliar characteristics, deadwood characteristics, where they grow, the environments and whatnot. So I think of those species, the one-seeds are probably the best for bonsai, but the Utah junipers are notoriously difficult to collect. And I think it was because a lot of people really weren't collecting a lot of soil with those plants. So in order to get the one-seeds to survive, Richard decided to try to approach those by taking out immense amounts of soil. So he was collecting these trees, and they were weighing 300, 400, 500, 600 pounds per tree. So he has specialized equipment. He's got a staff that helps him with all of that. He ran a landscaping company in Denver, so he had all of the necessary equipment to go out and collect these trees. But the transition process for those trees was essentially collecting them, bringing them directly to my place. We would keep them there for about 2 years in their situation there, which is basically either in a wooden box with all their original soil or balled and burlapped, basically. And then what we would do is what Richard would call releasing the root ball, which is essentially working out that field soil, kind of taking it back as far as we could. But in that 2-year time span from when they were collected to when we started releasing the root ball and taking that soil out, because we had been watering the trees so heavily, because we had been fertilizing the trees so heavily, they produced a ton of fine roots right around the base of the tree. So we were able to take out, in some cases, 80, 90% of the original field soil with a ton of fine fibrous roots right at the base and transition them over. So I don't recall ever losing a one-seed juniper to repotting in that process. We did lose a couple that he had collected and brought to my place. They just didn't survive the collecting process. But everything that we transitioned out in that way ended up surviving. So I think one thing you have to take into consideration if you go out and collect trees, or if you're buying a collected piece of material, is figuring out when it was collected and figuring out when you can then transition it over. Some trees you can do in a year. Some trees can take 4 or 5 years. Right? It's all based on how the tree responds to the collection process. So my experience comes more from that secondary aspect of it rather than the actual collecting process itself. But actually, the question I wanted to ask you guys was, when you collect these trees, how much field soil are you trying to retain in the root ball when you collect?
It's interesting because I think you said
Yeah.
you tend to go a little bit harder, whereas you were saying maybe that initial deciduous, you want to keep it a little bit tighter.
On the deciduous, I have to remove almost everything.
Yeah.
Because my environment is different from where she goes. My deciduous where I collect, they don't have fine roots. So basically, I just collect the stumps. Differently from, for example, the pines, where I try to collect as many fine roots as possible, and I do the same, theoretically, like Richard. I bring home a big root ball. What I do on pines, because they suffer lack of oxygen when you transition in the new environment, differently from junipers probably, I have to remove some soil at home. I open the bags and I work a little bit the around part of the root ball to free some roots into the new soil, because they need to have oxygen. Otherwise, if my pines grows in clay, like I think is, it's also like the juniper that the Ritzer collect is different clay, but same clay. There is no oxygen there. But if a pine, I just do a big bowl and bring horse to grow. But as I said, even for Dorsavina, they do everything with the foliage. It's just because they are there that they have some roots in that soil. But as soon as you bring home, that soil starts decreasing and rotting itself. And if there are roots, they will start rotting, then the fungal issues start.
Right.
That's why they have to pressure wash.
So like for me, I would never do that with our Rocky Mountain junipers here in the States, like a full bare rooting like that with the hose. I have seen that done before to bad effect with bad results. But in Spain and in Europe with the Sabinas, it seems to be a necessary thing. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with Rafa Torres. He owns Bonsai Central in Mallorca. I was going to work with them at least twice a year for a number of years. Essentially right when he started the nursery, he invited me over to kind of help build that out with them and help them with that process. But what I didn't realize is that in that environment, it doesn't get very cold in the winter, especially where his nursery is right along the coast there. So it very rarely gets down to freezing. So what that means is that the trees that they were bringing over from the mainland to Mallorca, like the Sabinas, for example, and like the Scots pines, for example, because they weren't taking out that old soil and because they weren't treating the root systems with fungicide, they were having immense amounts of death of those plants. We're talking like 60–70% of the plants they were bringing over were dying. So what they realized was that they needed to bare root those plants, and they actually started bare rooting the Scots pines on Mallorca as well, which I thought was crazy, but it actually ended up working. In addition to the bare rooting, at the same time, they were doing what you were doing when you collect some of the, like the oaks and whatnot, soaking the trees in fungicide. And they were using not systemics, but daconil. So they were taking like essentially what amounted to 1 tablespoon per gallon of water in the daconil and dunking the entire root system in that, and then potting the tree up. And their death rate went from 60–70% down to like 5 or 10%. Right? So they've been doing that consistently every spring since then and have had really good results with that. Now that's kind of an extreme environment because it doesn't get cold enough in the winter to kill off the diseases. That's why they have all these problems in the spring. In your environment here, I assume most of you are kind of from the Midwest and whatnot, so it gets cold enough that you don't have to worry about that too much. But it's something to take into consideration in certain environments.
Yeah, the location is everything in terms of strategy, because every one of us has a different environment, and we have to build a different strategy for different types of trees. So we have an overall understanding, these and these and these, plus then for every one of us, what I do in Los Angeles with California juniper, I don't do back in Europe with other trees. You have to build your strategy according to the place and the tree.
All these trees, definitely where you're going back to, where they're coming from, it's case by case scenario. You really can't blanket the statement certain things because aftercare is the most important thing, and it is going to be different from here and there. So when you're doing traditionally taking collected trees, what type of growing medium are you putting them in first? You said you do most things.
So I do conifer, pomace, and the Cirrus tree, I do a mix 50% pomace and 50% peat moss when they start. And then obviously when I do the next repotting, I transition the peat moss because on peat moss I don't have control of the water, on the moisture. I transition that to macadam.
So you do a little organic before
yeah, I
you
need to
that
do organic
straight
because
transition.
when they don't have roots, they are basically a big cutting, I need to add moisture there. Then I transition because when I go to the pot and I start, wiring the trees, pruning, I need to have the control and I need to know how much water this tree is drinking, and the only way is using macadam.
I use the same for everything, for all broadleaf trees. It's 80% of baked, no, expanded clay, how it works, yeah? Expanded clay and 20% of white peat.
Okay.
Sometimes in that 80% I put a part of pumice or pumice, mix pumice and baked loam or only pumice, and that's it.
So then do you eventually try to transition some of that out, or is that kind
No,
of...
it's staying all the time
okay.
the same, yeah.
And Marija, are your trees mostly bare root when you collect them?
No.
You retain some soil?
In major cases, I remove almost all soil. If the root bore is really damaged, then And if I see that there are small roots inside the original soil, then I'm not touching it. In that moment, I will do that in 5 years when it's next reporting. If it's possible, but if it's not, it will stay there forever, because it's only, I don't know, 5% or 10%. It's not for deciduous and evergreen trees. It's not important. And maybe I can mention olives. You can collect olives without anything. You can even come and cut olive or the branch of the olive or 2 meters high, and then you forget it for 6 days, and then you put it into the soil, and it starts growing.
In Brazil, my client got a big olive from south of Brazil, and we split that tree in 11 pieces. Francisco did that. We split that tree in 11 pieces, even the apex. We put everything in sand and put in a greenhouse, and every piece of root in like 3 months. No, that's not fair. Everything I plant, I need to care like a baby, otherwise they fucking die.
Tropical, the ficus and stuff, you know, in Florida, they cut the branches off, they fall on the ground, and you got a new tree.
And if you put the olive in a heating bed with the foil over, after a few months, it starts rooting on the branches. So the roots are everywhere on the tree.
Andrew, what type of, so you typically are going into pumice, or you soil?
Yeah, with broadleaf trees, I always get a root and put them right into my bonsai soil, kind of like what Marija does. And that's one of the biggest differences. I work with a lot of conifers from the Rockies, and so, you know, that's a very slow process to transition over from the native soil to the bonsai soil. But the nice thing about deciduous or broadleafs are you can just put them right in your soil mix. It goes right in the pot the first time, and if you need a temporary pot, you can do that. But if you have a nice pot, you can put it right in the pot, and you're kind of ready to start building branches. The tricky thing with deciduous, though, is it's not as instant of a bonsai as a conifer. You know, you collect a nice ponderosa pine or Rocky Mountain juniper, you can have it, you know, once you transition into a bonsai pot, you can have it in a show in 5 or 6 years. Deciduous broadleaf tree, you're cutting it back to a stump, and then you have 10 years of ramification and branching to kind of build back, to be back in this show shape.
Yeah, but it is possible to find deciduous trees with many branches.
More rare, but yeah.
Yeah, what I notice now, there is a little bit of a tendency that I disagree on trying to transition the Yamadori very fast into small containers, and in my opinion, make all the process much longer. My strategy is always building the structure first and making the tree mature in a bigger container, because the tree has more energy, and only at that time transition to a smaller container where you can control the strength of the tree. But if you go from Yamadori to small container right away, even before starting the tree, I think for many species that will work against you and make all the process much longer, because the tree in a small container, or most of the tree in a small container, they will not build up volumes so fast as they could do in a better container.
So we need to, after we're taking these off the mountains, working them back, get them in a box or your original container, we need to build a root system before we can take it further there.
Sorry, go ahead.
I don't do it. I put it immediately in the dimensions of so how the pot will look like.
But then that allows you for a couple of years
I put it in the boxes for fishes. What is it? Styrofoams. So it's already, but it's not a problem. It must be the height must be shallow, but it can be a little bit larger. So that is not a problem to cut. But if you put it in something that is deep like this, and you want it then to put it in, no.
It's like recollecting it again almost. If you
and you will have all the crown and everything, and you are making a double stress to the tree, and I think that is not a good approach. At least it's not mine.
So when you collect something and you build, let's say, a wooden box to put it in, like how, percentage-wise, how much bigger?
At least for my conifer, I at least double of what I would think will be the final part.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, because I know, I have gotten a lot of trees into my nursery from the guys at Backcountry, and what they typically do, when they go out and collect the tree, they take whatever duff comes with the plant, they try not to disturb the root ball at all, and then they'll build a box that essentially fits the shape of that root ball, and it's not much bigger than the root ball was itself. It's actually quite small. And I talked to Steve about why they do that, and his philosophy was if they put that in something too large and put it in pure pumice, the pumice actually holds a lot of moisture, and then you end up with a problem where the tree doesn't dry out at all. The soil medium here, in this case, pumice, doesn't dry out at all. You end up with root rot on the tree. But I always thought it seemed a little overly small, but I never had a problem with any of their trees dying as a result of root rot afterwards. So it actually works really, really well. And taking it from their environment where it's incredibly dry, there's no humidity. These guys are collecting in Wyoming. No humidity, tons of wind whipping through there. And you bring it down to Tennessee where it's 80-90% humidity every day in the summer, they grow like weeds. And for the most part, I was dealing with junipers. So like Mauro mentioned, they're taking up a lot of that moisture through the foliage. They don't necessarily need a whole lot of soil, or in this case, again, pumice, to keep the trees alive. But I always wondered about that, like percentage-wise, how
See,
much...
on the pines I collect, I need to do that. Otherwise, they will start suffering as hell. I need to give extra space to develop the roots.
Do you aerate the core of those root balls when you do the initial repotting? Okay.
I free all the roots around to get those roots into the new soil.
But the core of soil...
No, I don't touch that. No.
You don't aerate
Eventually,
it?
what I do after a year, if the tree after a year is strong, I go with a vacuum cleaner and I poke some of that clay away, and I vacuum cleaner away, and then I substitute with pumice. So it's not really a repot, because a year is not enough to establish the tree, but at least I'm started removing that bad soil for the roots.
But sorry, pumice is drying out very well. Maybe the good idea is before planting into the pumice, to wash out the pumice so that you remove that small particles, everything that is smaller than 2 millimeters that you remove, you can sow it and then plant into it, because pumice is perfect. It's really drying out.
I use big pumice. I mean,
big.
8 to 13 millimeters. That's big,
Yeah.
because more air is better for my Yamadori.
You take that approach with the pines and the junipers? Or?
I don't collect many juniper back in Europe. When I collect the juniper, the tricks are a little bit similar to the one here. I have to put them in a greenhouse. For example, you met Felix in Spain. We went collecting together. We put the trees in a greenhouse. He has to use lava rock and not pumice, because over there you need a little bit more water retention, because pumice for them in Spain is too dry and dry out so fast. So really opposite than what you said.
Yeah, that's interesting, because of the soil components that we typically use, the akadama pumice, lava rock, and maybe kiyu, there's a competition between akadama and pumice as to how much moisture they'll actually absorb and how long they'll hold that moisture. Akadama holds a little bit more. Akadama is obviously a bit organic, so it's got CEC as well, although technically pumice has a little bit of that too, right? So of those components, pumice is fighting for the #1 spot in terms of how much water it absorbs, but it releases it back to the tree, right? And it also, it's more integrity in the pumice than there is in akadama, meaning that it doesn't break down.
Yeah,
like
what I
akadama
noticed
does over
between
time.
the pumice here in US and our pumice are two factors. Your pumice has a lot of what Maria said, a lot of those dusty parts, plus the porosity is not only inside, is also outside. Because I think that pumice get break down to a smaller size. Our pumice has those kind of air balls inside. My big pumice, if I throw in water, float.
Yeah, ours seems like rock.
So that is the difference, because I have something in the pot of my pine that inside is dry. Even if I water, it's not absorbing, because those little holes, differently from lava rocks, that the porosity is all connected like a wasp net. That pumice, because it's from eruption, it gets sealed there. And my big particles, they are so floating that is, again, if I throw in water, they stay. I think
That's interesting.
your pumice
Well,
is
and our pumice in the US is very different depending on the source.
Yes.
So Oregon pumice has a very high density of porosity. Pumice from New Mexico, there's a company called Hess, maybe some of you have gotten pumice from. That's some of the worst pumice. It's mostly like gravel. It's 3 times the weight. The backcountry guys used to use that.
Yeah.
Now they drive to Oregon and get a big pumice from us. But depending on the vein, the pumice quality can be really different, even here in the country.
And it's, of course, in the climate where you are is also important. It's not the same. In Spain, it's very dry. Where I live, it's very dry.
my summer is dry, and for me pumice work great because I want to keep my tree dry.
Yeah, in the summer, my watering system is working 6 times a day. 6 times a day, and plus I'm watering every 2 or 3 days manually everything.
Yeah.
So
It's also when you do the deciduous tree, for me it's the opposite, for example. In summer I water less than spring and autumn because my conifer need less water in summer than in spring and autumn. It's completely different strategy.
So it's interesting, you kind of hear through this conversation how...
And then you have a big confusion in your mind, you don't understand. You go and you kill all your trees. This is of this discussion.
But it's really important, as you're hearing different artists talk about it, it's a really, none of it, do not take any of it for gospel. Take each piece, kind of experiment with it.
You have to
in your
rely
own
on
environment.
local people that have experience. This is everywhere. I
And
mean,
then-
if I go in Croatia, I will ask Marija all the advice to make my tree surviving well. If I go in somewhere else, I will ask the local people because that is the experience.
And
Because you see, everyone has a different trick, a different approach, and works. But
Yeah.
I live in the middle of the Dolomites. She lives in Croatia. You live here.
Yeah. So it's all different. So it's important to kind of find out what works
It's
for
about
you
the
in your
context,
situation and adjust it. Take tips and advice from professionals and kind of tailor it to your own system. What about me? So I'm very similar to I'm doing on the East Coast where I'm from. We're taking, and it's interesting kind of what Bjorn was talking about a little bit in the different areas that you're collecting. You're actually going to get different root balls. If you go out to the Rocky Mountains, a lot of these trees you're looking for often are in actually pockets on these outcrops. So they have these natural little pockets. The junipers in New Mexico, from the pictures I've seen, some of the videos I've seen Richard do, often it's more of a flat landscape. And in my opinion, similar to what I have to deal with on the East Coast, where it's more flat, and you're getting big root balls. You're able to actually dig down, try to find that taproot so you can get these big root balls. So there's actually different types of collecting depending on the environment you're in, on a mountain or you're just in the foothills. So that's going to make a difference on how you do it. Typically, I'm very similar to a lot of this is where, depending if the tree's really strong, really healthy, deciduous trees, I like to try to start working out some of that, that field soil earlier on. Of course, it's case by case, depending on if the tree's happy, if it has a lot of feeder roots, and getting some of that pumice, or in some cases, maybe a little bit of bonsai mix to kind of help build that initial root ball. Collected junipers and pines, same thing. You don't mess with those as much because they're a little bit more finicky with the roots, but trying to, over that first session or two, get some areas, kind of work out that old soil and get some good pumice in there to start growing more finer feeder roots.
How far south are you on?
So North Carolina. So getting back to that a little bit, do you, in some of your approaches, maybe on that second, third repotting, you still have some collected soil in there? What do you try, if you do have some of that, you're experiencing some of that, do you ever go in and maybe do like a half bare root or wedge sections or anything to kind of...
So the goal is to end up with a tree in a mature stage in the type of soil you want to use. Bonsai, let's talk in general, 1-1-1, Akadana, pumice lava, or whatever mix of inorganic you want to use. So that's not a basic rule. Let's say into repot, I need to remove the original soil, but what I try to do, at least before styling a tree, I try to have 70, 80, or even more % of the root ball into the new soil. Because again, I don't have control of the humidity in the part of the original soil. And when we manipulate the trees and they get into a stressful period after the manipulation, if the roots are not able to talking about conifer in general, if the roots are not able to breathe, the trees start having problems. So faster I can get the tree into a good mix, better is for that tree. And more I'm planning to do in terms of manipulation, more original soil I need to get rid of faster possible.
So what about maybe some cases, Bjorn, I'll throw this one to you. In cases where you have a old, and we're talking about, again, transitioning, I find sometimes that these really old bonsai have been bonsai for a long time. They tend to almost have, these maybe dead sections in there, just really root bound. How do you go about transitioning maybe a root-bound tree into reinvigorating that root ball in a way?
Yeah, and some of that's going to be dependent on the species.
Yeah, right.
Obviously. Yeah. So, certain species are very finicky if you try working the core. I don't know if you guys have heard this word sheen in bonsai. It's essentially the core of the root ball right up underneath the trunk, basically. So I kind of touched back on the question you threw tomorrow a second ago. When I'm working with Yamadori and transitioning over to good soil, and then in subsequent repottings throughout the years, I'm trying to work that core back little by little, but I never take the approach of fully trying to remove that core. I try to get as much out of there as possible, but especially with from my experience, pine, but also somewhat with junipers as well, the trees end up weakening severely as a result of that, especially if it's done too quickly. I also don't particularly subscribe or like the idea of doing the half bare root on a root system. Certain roots on a plant are feeding certain branches on the tree, and this is really true when it comes to the junipers, right? That's why if you cut a branch off of a juniper, you're going to kill the live vein all the way down the base of the tree and the roots that are feeding that. So from the flip side perspective, if you're half bare rooting a tree, you're potentially weakening those roots, you bare root it, and killing off a portion of the top of the tree, or vice versa. Maybe you invigorate that section of the tree while the other half of the tree gets weak, and because you've invigorated that section, the other half is going to die off.
Yeah, it's always better to work all the around in the same way.
Exactly. From
The halfway doesn't work even for me.
Exactly. Yeah. So the longer you work on these trees, the more you should be working that core back little by little. But of course, you're acquiring trees from other people. Maybe they weren't maintained properly, and now you end up with a core that's incredibly rock hard. That's very, very difficult to work with. Some species are going to respond better to getting really aggressive with that core than other species. So most deciduous trees, like maples, for example, Stewardia, plants like that, even if they're older plants, are going to respond relatively well to getting pretty aggressive with that. You're talking about something like a needle juniper, those are hard to work with anyway, right? And a lot of people get scared to work with the roots because they're finicky, so you end up with an insanely rock hard core. I've seen that so many times with that species, and common juniper as well, it's very similar, right? So to work that out is almost impossible, right? So in that perspective, or in those cases, what I try to do is aerate those cores as much as possible without getting aggressive, actually taking soil away and potentially tearing roots out. And depending on the scenario, if it's a situation where it's very, very hard, rather than working that with a wooden chopstick and picking little by little, I may even take a leather punch and hammer it into the core of the root ball. That's a pretty rare thing to have to do, but in some extreme cases, you might need to do that. But in general, if you're working these trees on your own and developing them properly, you shouldn't end up with that ridiculously hard core to the root system of the plant. But from my perspective, especially with conifers, I almost never am going to take that entirely out of the plant. Right? It might be different for you guys, but that's, from my experience.
You have to build it first when you start with Yamadori. That's the other thing, because I end up, a lot of my pines, for example, they grow on a surface that is 5 inches, 10 inches over the clay. Everything is there, so they don't have that core. You have to build it up while you transition every time and move it from the original container to the next one and to the next one, and you build up that section. Totally different than a mature tree from Japan. Even when you have to restyle, that tree has already the core because it's been a bonsai. Even if it's neglected for many years, it's been a bonsai for decades, and he has that section. For Yamadori, most of the time, we have to build everything from scratch in terms of root ball. Also because we start with trees that a lot of time they have strong, thick roots. And when you start transitioning, then they go back and they regrow from the base, and they start regrowing some smaller roots because they find good soil close by. And then you build up that section.
And I think it's a little important too, one thing I think about in repotting, some of the collected trees is you'll often see these really old, especially junipers, collected junipers, that have these, a lot of times a taproot that we're cutting off and, just working with a few roots in the beginning. And often those roots will, kind of be lignified, a little bit harder roots. So it's really important to really work on kind of getting those fine feeder roots. That's really is what's going to keep the health of the tree strong. Fine feeder roots, once they get hard and lignified, they're not actually producing, sucking up water. So it's really important to, with the particular mixes, with maybe how far you're pushing that initial maybe taproot back to really work it to a nice, strong, fine feeder roots to kind of start the basis of that tree. So far, are there any questions? Any particular questions? Yes.
Have you guys experimented with top dressing at all? So like what I've done, I'm up in Idaho, I collect some trees and I use sphagnum moss and I grate it, get it really fine. And I've found that to be helpful for my trees in that recovery process, just on top of it, because it's super dry where I'm at. And it retains a little bit of that moisture.
Which species?
Pines, junipers, western junipers, but pondos. But I've also done it with like, I don't know, spruces, firs, subalpine firs. I've even experimented a little bit with bedding, shavings, pine shavings and bedding, kind of top dress.
So doing top dressing from trees?
And I've done it on deciduous.
I don't do it. I actually have to go away from moisture with my conifer because I have already moisture around. So
in your particular environment.
In my environment, I need to get rid of the extra moisture. And my Yamadori during the season, I water like very superficially once a week because they have to stay as dry as possible to not have any issue. So I use top dressing eventually only on some repotting when I mess up some roots and I need to, maintain the superficial roots, the fine roots a little bit more moisture, like on the cedar tree when I repot. That's the only case I use.
More toward refined trees that
yes,
you would be doing that. How about you guys?
No, I don't use it, but I believe that you can use it. Everybody can use it for broadleaf trees in dry climates. Yes, it can be used. For pines, no.
I'll use it later in the process. So I'm a big believer that most established bonsai should have the top dressing or some moss. If you don't have moss on an established bonsai, you have to dig down about an inch in the pot before you find any live roots. And if your pot's 20 inches by 18 inches, that's 20 inches by 18 inches by 1 inch of volume that you're not utilizing in the pot. But for collected deciduous, I think because we're often bare rooting, putting them in the soil, I want to see the actual soil in the beginning. There's not a lot of roots in there. Often we have these big cut pieces in there, not fine roots, but big, huge, cut roots. And so once I start getting a lot of fine roots in the container, then I'll put a top dressing on and start treating it that way. But I want to see the soil drying out at first.
Any other questions? Yeah.
I had two. One, I was really liking the fungicide conversation, and I was just wondering if anybody else had strong opinions about what kind of, like the Daconel piece. I would initially think to do Subdu Max, for the root rot potential of that. Are there any other considerations, thoughts you guys have?
In Europe, we use a lot Aliette. I think you have it here. Fossetil aluminium is one of the active principles of the product.
Are you using systemic? Is that a systemic?
No, it's not systemic, but it's very good, especially I use it on all my trees in early spring when the season still have to catch up because it can be hot, humid, and then very dry and sunny. So this fluctuation of temperature can allow the fungal issue on the trees because the tree is pushing and then it's cold again, so it's stopping. So I pour water and a little bit of Aliette on all my trees, either collected or finished trees, and these help a little bit if any fungal issue spora can attack the tree while the tree is in this situation of like waking up to really start the season.
And then the second one was around the peat conversation, which I found really interesting. I would be terrified to do that in North Carolina. Tyler and I are from North Carolina area, and that would scare the hell out of me. But I was wondering, I also heard a story once about that in Europe the peat was a little different. And I was wondering if that might be
We
part
call
of
it, I don't,
Sphagnum moss.
for them sphagnum moss is
White
really,
peat, Lithuanian white peat.
yeah, no, for me, peat moss is the black, for them actually, is that black kind of soil that is.
Almost just like a potting mix. Almost.
Exactly, that
I think it's broken
is
down.
coming out from whatever leaves and organic soil from the forest that first start. For us, is the torba.
So that kind of scares us when we hear peat. It's
Exactly.
like we're gonna go from this collected soil, the mountain soil, and put that right back in. That's like, why would we ever do that? We want to go to bonsai, so
Yeah.
it's slightly different.
For me, that works great for the cedus tree. I don't use this peat moss for my conifer, but for the cedus tree, yes, 50% of pumice, 50% of peat moss, that always work fantastic.
Does it have more structure than I'm imagining? Like this, that was what I heard, that European peat had almost a grain size to it.
It's very fibrous,
Okay.
and really develop. I have take out some trees after a year being there, and the root ball was unbelievable.
It's a really good temporary soil for
Yeah.
deciduous.
Temporary soil is the perfect.
Yeah, but it's
but it has
decomposed. With the time,
yeah.
it's
it
decomposed.
has a shelf life. I most of my collected Telperion trees, they were in these grow bags. I brought them home, I cut the grow bag off, and I put them in perlite and potting soil. I used a higher quality potting soil. The thing I don't like about the sphagnum or the peat moss is it gets really hydrophobic once it gets dry. If you use a higher quality potting soil, things that are mostly cocoa fibers, composted bark, back guano, higher quality ingredients, it's the same effect, but it doesn't have the hydrophobic quality, works a little bit better. It's a really good temporary soil for Gillen and probably wet. Might be a little too wet for some conifers, but.
If you're talking about a shelf life, how long do you find that is? How fast do you have to transition out of the temporary soil?
Usually 10 to 12 years is the max for that soil. So for a temporary bonsai, it works great, but the reason that we don't want to bonsai in that permanently is, if you have to bare root your tree, every
Yeah.
10 years. You don't want to bare root a
control.
vine.
Yeah, you don't have control of whatever is happening there.
So I guess a specific but also broad. With deciduous trees that you do mostly bare root and you're putting them into a container, like what are your markers to say 2, 3, or 4 years until you do root work again, and specifically with American beech? I guess you have collected American beech.
I've collected American beech. Usually when you're putting it in the pot, the types of trees that we're collecting, they don't have a lot of fine roots. So it's not, 2 years and it's suddenly full of roots. It takes 4, 5, 6 years to fill up the pot. After that, you can start to get in a more normal cadence of repotting every 2 or 3 years. But I tend to leave, as long as I'm happy with the container and not trying to transfer it to a bonsai pot or something. I put it in a good size that's going to develop the tree. We often cut these back to a stump. So I'm putting them into a larger pot and then growing them into that kind of size pot. And then I wait 5, 6 years, put it in a box or something, and then transition it to a pot.
So you could be 5 or more years from the time you collect it before you disturb the roots again.
That's what I do, but I'm also putting it right into my bonsai soil. So I put it in Akadama and pumice right away. So, and then after that time, it's totally filled up that container with roots, and then I can go back in and root prune, repot, root graft, try and make improvements.
You know that you need to repot because the water is not running to the pot. Also, one good signal is, in my climate, is a moss. If I have a moss naturally in the pot, it means that it's too moist and that I need to do a repotting. Yeah. Also, some species, it's not the same with every species. Hornbeam can be, 5 to 10 years in the same pot. But for example, Prunus cerasifera, it's a wild plum. I believe that you have it here. They are growing like hell. In 3 years, you have a rock in the pot, and you need to crack the pot to put the roots out, and then you need what is the name of that electrical smoke stain. Yeah. So you need to cut through it, and it's.
The sawzall is a really helpful tool for. That's the luxury that you get with deciduous or broadleaf trees is we make that first cut when we begin. It's not like we have one root that goes and wraps around, and if we cut it with the sawzall, it kills off all the roots from the plant. We get a little bit more luxury to kind of cut freely.
Yeah, what about the fertilization process of the collected trees?
Yeah. So after collecting the tree, how do you go about fertilizing? You start feeding it? Are you waiting a while? Are you immediately doing it?
So for
Organic versus liquid?
Yeah, so for conifer, for example, what I do in the last few years, I'm first of all using acid on the roots to improve more rooting. It's called endobutyric acid. So I spray, when I pot the tree, I spray the roots with that, and this will help increasing the amount of roots that the tree is producing that same season.
Is this the same acid that you're going to find in like rooting hormone?
Yes,
Okay.
but it's just in high quantity. And actually it's a Spanish company that does it commercially. They do for nursery, when they do this bigger potting on moving trees, I discovered with that. And it's fantastic. I mean, some trees I would never give a penny to them to survive. They made it because that.
It's almost like a trick to help that shock, that
yeah,
shock
exactly,
a little bit.
exactly. You spray on the roots and really activate the hormonal system of the roots, and they start growing straight away. I don't fertilize the first season of my trees into the container because I feel that finer roots are still a little bit weak, tender. I don't want to put fertilizer still, and I want to increase the amount of roots that will be scouting the soil to find elements and everything. I will only start fertilizing from the second season. Normally, when the tree is still into stage of development before styling, I go very high in nitrogen, so the tree gets and build up energy faster. And since the first styling, then I go with the type of more basic, mild fertilization to have control of whatever the tree is doing.
Organic?
I only use organic in the roots and chemical in the foliage. This was always my strategy.
First year I don't fertilize. I just let everything grow. It is possible at the end of summer to put some organic fertilizer at the top of the pot. So with the watering, it will go down. But actually, it's not necessary. And the next year I'll start. Yeah, because the substrate in which the tree is growing is completely inert. It's a vacant dome and white peat, and there is nothing inside, and you have maybe only 5 to 10% of original soil with something inside. So you need to start fertilizing.
And again, you're doing organic.
And it's organic and also mineral combination.
I'm a little different. I start fertilizing the first year. I live 20 minutes away from Randy Knight, who's probably the most prolific collector in the United States, a good friend of mine. And he fertilizes with full-strength Miracle-Gro starting day one when it's collected. The hose-on attachment waters it right on the plant. And that's his system. It works really well for him. Like we said, develop a system that works for you.
Yeah, but it's a question because the root is damaged and how much the root is working at the beginning.
Yeah.
So it's not. Maybe I don't have a.
They have the luck here in the US that they collect in these rock pockets.
Yeah, and so
So basically,
You're not
whatever they find, they put inside of that. So then the roots start growing straight away, and they are searching for. They don't have to touch the roots much. So that's probably the explanation of that strategy.
I use a really low, mild fertilizer, but I actually fertilize every single day. I have an injection system in my hose. It's basically the concept of a solid fertilizer. I'm using, what comes out of my hose is 2.4, 0.8, 1.6, so really, really small macronutrients, but it's just getting a little bit each time, and so I collect a tree, it kind of goes home and gets that real gentle fertilizer, but each time it gets watered.
So on your, a lot of the one seeds, when you're bringing those in, those are a lot of times more freshly collected. How are you treating those with fertilizer?
Well, so because Richard would collect such massive amounts of soil with them, certainly on the periphery of that soil match, you're going to have roots that were cut back, but there's a decent amount of fine rootage up on the interior that hasn't been damaged. So quite often with those trees, I would throw essentially Osmocote Plus on them, just a few handfuls, because we're talking root balls that are like 4, 5, 6 feet across, right? So I put a vast majority of that synthetic fertilizer right at the base of the trunk and try to produce as much rootage right there as possible. I also, typically with those trees, would start doing foliar feeding as well, and also re-drenching with organics. So I have, or I had what was called an easy flow system, super easy thing. It's not technically a fertilizer injector system like what you have. It's like a bucket essentially that you attach to the spigot of your hose. It then filters water through it. You put a concentrated liquid fertilizer in that bucket, filters water through it, and then sends it out through the hose. It's actually diluting the fertilizer little by little as you go, whereas the true injector system will actually suck the fertilizer up and put it in line with the hose. So it disappears over time, but it's always the same concentrate that's coming out of the back end. But when it comes to these one seeds or even the Rocky Mountain junipers, I'll be doing that easy flow application typically with liquid kelp and liquid fish in a sort of a pre-mixed version of it. There's a really good company on Amazon, or you can buy it through Amazon, called GS Plant Food. They make all sorts of organic products, pretty inexpensive. And one of the products they have is this pre-mixed liquid fish and kelp. If you've ever dealt with liquid fish by itself, it can get kind of goopy. But if it's pre-mixed with the kelp, it's actually very liquidy and it's very easy to put into an easy flow system like that. Right, but I'll do that typically right from the get-go once those trees show up in my nursery. I do have to say though, the Rocky Mountain junipers and any of the trees that, like the backcountry guys collected that I brought to my nursery, those were collected typically in like April, May, June, and they wouldn't get to my nursery until the fall when everything's going dormant, and they're not fertilizing at all from my understanding while they're in Wyoming. So that first growing season, none of those trees are getting fertilized. Once they get to my garden the following spring is when I start fertilizing. Whereas the one seed junipers, Richard was collecting those again in April, May, June. Those were coming straight to my nursery that same summer, and I would fertilize those again with the Osmocote Plus and the liquid fishing kelp.
Do you have any, are there any special rules that may apply to harvesting deciduous conifers, like Larix or Balsicus, for initial collection?
I don't deal with larch at all. Actually, I didn't really deal with Balsicus at my nursery.
Same. Hate Balsicus. Sorry.
So the bigger difference between the larch here in US, Larix tamarack, what we call tamaracks, Larix laricina, and our European larch, I would treat our European like a conifer. They grow most of all in the mountain, high mountain, places with rocks and everything. Differently from when I collect Larix laricina here in, for example, up to the, what's the name, Grand Rapids, Michigan area, where they grow in bogs, so they grow in water. So you can almost treat them like deciduous. So I collect a lot of them almost with no roots, and then I pot them in, what's that soil that has the same cationic exchange like Akadama that you have also.
Oh, the
Diatomaceous earth?
Sorry.
Diatomaceous earth?
No, it's kind of bluish.
Shale?
No, it's not shale.
Not turf.
No,
Turf is terrible, right?
No.
Turf is terrible. Everybody hear that?
It starts like this, Mauro. It's even worse.
Anyway, so it's a soil that holds a lot of moisture, and basically even for these larches, it can hold moisture and they can root fast. We use the same soil like eastern white cedar and larches that come from these bogs, and they have basically layers of root balls. I tend to keep the upper layer and basically flat cut whatever trunk is on the other part, because in the bogs, according to the season, the water has different height. So there is spring as one layer, summer as another layer, and winter as another layer. So I cut them off and put in that soil that holds a lot of moisture, and almost all of them survive. So completely different strategy according to larches here in US than European larch.
One thing I wanted to kind of mention, talk about a little bit, I like is with specifically with
I
our...
got it, zeolite.
Okay, yes.
Zeolite.
Bluish, zeolite bluish.
Yeah, it's
Here.
here is kind
Yeah.
of good.
It's reddish.
It's reddish.
So with some of a lot of us are working with these native American junipers, one thing that I think we should really think about a little bit is, often we're taking these root balls and really trying to work them down to eventually get into a bonsai pot. One thing we ought to think about doing a little bit more of possibly is root grafting. Just really completely forgetting about the old root system, putting a nice, more compact root system exactly where we want it is a good way, often done in Japan, for those professionals working these trees. Got a big collected tree, if it's going to take many years to shrink it down and create a healthy root system, grafting roots on it can be kind of a sidetrack, a little bit quicker track to actually create a nicer root ball, more healthy. We can from the get-go kind of start out with a small, often we're using cuttings, whips that are a couple years old, small, good collected root or good root balls already, and kind of grow those out. So you kind of do that process in reverse. Instead of growing, trying to shrink it down, you're actually then building it up, but from a good basis in the beginning. So that's something I'd really suggest, especially if you're using Itoigawa Kishu roots, much stronger, more healthier roots than often a collected root.
Yeah, the only trouble with that is time frame wise, is you gotta make sure that the tree that was collected is healthy.
That's correct, yes,
before
absolutely.
you start grafting onto it. So it might be healthy when you collect it, but through the collection process, it weakens the plant. Then you throw a graft on in that same year that it was collected, for example, or even the following year, it may fail as a result of that. The tree itself needs to be healthy. And this is actually true if you want to change out the foliage on a tree as well. Some junipers, you collect them, like a Rocky for example, and they just explode with growth in that first season when you collect them, first growing season. And you can graft them the very next, let's say, February or March, right? So I had a tree that the guys from backcountry collected for me in, I think it was June, a couple years back. And in February, so was that like 8 months later, I grafted the tree. I put, I think 100 grafts on the plant. A vast majority of them took, and now that tree, a year later, is almost entirely replaced with Itoigawa foliage. That's incredibly rare to be able to do that, though, right? So you need to have the tree pumping, you need to have that cambium swelling, the tissue swelling. That also goes for the root grafts as well. Some of the Rockies that you collect are going to have, very thin cambium layers, but as they get healthy and as you fertilize them and as they start growing, it starts swelling a bit, and it becomes easier to throw those grafts on there. Right, so yeah, it can certainly expedite the process, but you gotta make sure the tree is.
Well, I'd venture to guess that probably all of us would say, and probably one of the most important things when you do any bonsai work, the most important thing is you need to have a strong, healthy tree before you do anything. That's really the most important thing. We're trying to, we love these things. They're gonna respond better if you have a healthy tree.
And also when you collect it.
Yep. Making sure you're trying to.
Sometimes in nature you find the trees that are at the end of the line, and it's very dangerous to collect because they will not have that click to basically. Sometimes I feel, at least for example on mugo pines, in my mountain I live in the middle of the Dolomites, some areas that mugo are extremely old and they are at the last section of their life. I bring soil there to revitalize the tree for a season or two and then collect.
A healthy tree in nature.
Exactly, because otherwise, for example, now we are collecting some Scots pine in Norway, and some trees are extremely weak, and a weak tree will never survive collection. So we are fertilizing the tree. They grow in moss, so we bring fertilizer in summer before collecting the next spring, and basically we push up the energy of the tree as much as possible. And then the season after, we collect the tree.
You all knew we were crazy. Absolutely, we are crazy bonsai people. Yes.
You say root graft on Rocky?
Yes. Can you use